Okay, hey folks, Mark Locklear here, and a quick screencast on Chapter 7 and how to code subqueries. I really like this chapter a lot. I think there's a lot of good stuff here, um, not just specifically the part about coding subqueries, but we're going to look at one of the sections specifically, the how to handle complex queries. And I think in my opinion, the most valuable part of this chapter is probably that how to um, how to create complex queries, because I think the nuts and bolts and the steps that it gives you there really apply to everything that you do in SQL, but not just in SQL. So you could apply those into like other parts of code and information technology and like maybe other stuff in life too. But anyway, we'll get to that. So how to code subqueries. So the sort of gist of this is this idea. All a subquery is you can think of it like I like the term. I think they use it here of a nested query. So at this point, you've been exposed to loops and like four loops, and you know that you can nest loops within loops. So that's kind of what you're doing with, in fact, it's exactly what you're doing with queries here. You've got a larger query, and then within that, you've actually got smaller queries within this larger query, and you can nest these, make them as large as you want. I think the same caveats apply in the general programming world as far as having nested loops or anytime you have any kind of nested logic. um, they're often necessary, but again, just be careful, because it's usually a good warning sign that when any kind of nested logic becomes, I like the sort of 2 or 3 levels deep. Anytime it gets beyond, I would say 2 levels deep, that's a good red flag to think about. Is there a better way to do it? Now, again, sometimes things are just uh, necessarily sophisticated such that there's no other way to do it. Or, yeah, maybe there's another way to do it, but you're really just sort of moving furniture around, and it's if there's a if there's a particular piece of complex logic, it's probably going to be complex regardless of how you do it. Now, maybe it's more readable in one way, or maybe it's more efficient in another way, but again, it's just something to think about anytime you have nested logic in place. So in this case, we're talking about nested queries. So essentially, this sort of gives you the sort of rules of the road, if you will, that generally there's 4 ways to introduce a subquery within a select statement. So you can do it in the where, having, from, or select clause. And so you can see a real super simple example here where we've got a simple select statement from invoices where invoice total is greater than, and then rather than saying, a less sophisticated example might just say where invoice total is less than $2,000. In this case, we're saying where invoice total is less than or is greater than, and then we've got another select statement we're calling. In this case, we're getting the average. We're creating an average of the invoice totals, and so we're saying where the invoice total is greater than the average of all invoices. So that's an example of again, pretty straightforward nested query. When to use queries. So here's an example here where they're comparing inner joins. So lots of times these can take the places of join statements. And it really just depends on how your brain processes this data, on which one is easier to read. I think that's a key component to this. From an efficiency standpoint, I don't think the book made this point. I don't think there's much difference in, at least like the example you have here, that from a performance standpoint, they're both probably going to perform equally. So it more comes down to what's more readable, what's more maintainable over time. So that's what you think about when you're trying to weigh the difference between, in this case, the first example, we've got an inner join here that's going to return a particular result set. And then in the second example, you're using a nested query. So again, sort of just depends on the way your brain works. We've talked about join statements where we're taking these two tables and laying them on top of one another. Again, this subquery does the same thing. You've got your initial select statement is going to be this first query, and then this where statement, again, rather than you doing a join to join these two, you are, in this case, you're using this where vendor ID in. So the idea is that where the vendor ID is going to be in this given result set that's going to be returned from the select statement. So again, I won't get too far in the weeds there. Just, the best way is to experiment with these, take and paste these into MySQL and just see the result sets. Again, in this case, you're going to get the exact same result set that's going to be returned. So it's just sometimes a matter of preference, and or if you're in a production environment, maybe you're working with a larger team. Lots of times when you go, if you're joining an existing team of folks and on a large project that maybe already uses SQL, there's probably going to be a standard way that you do queries like this, where maybe the general way is to use join statements, and that's probably, I suspect, that's what you would find in most production shops, as opposed to doing a nested query like you would see here. Okay. So the rest of these are just examples of using where clauses, where having, using subqueries inside those. The big thing I want to jump to here is, and we're going to use this in the example that we work on, is this idea of how to create or how to work with or how to create complex queries. So in this case, good example. I mean, this is, by all measures, this is a pretty sophisticated set of queries here, right? You've got this first select statement. Just the select statement by itself is, somewhat complex, and then we've got a join statement when we're joining it with a second, equally complex select statement. The details are not the details of this particular example are not as important as what we want to talk about, which is how do you even begin to tackle something like this? Because, again, in a production environment, you may have a product manager you're working with, and they've got a customer who says, you know what, we've got a report that we want to create, and they would start to outline the requirements for what that particular report would include, and so you have to synthesize that. Your product manager and obviously your customers don't know SQL. So it's going to be up to you to have a conversation with your product manager, ask the right questions, because they often don't know the right questions to ask. Go back and ask their customers, but to be able to ask the right questions and then synthesize the request so that you can actually begin to write a query for them. And often in a scenario like that, it's not like it's a one and done kind of thing. You're going to write a query and give them the result back, and then based on that, they're going to be like, you know what, this is not quite what we wanted. Actually, we wanted, instead of the average of invoices, we wanted the mean. Let's say, I mean, customers come up with all kinds of stuff. They are lots of times when they're thinking about data and thinking about what they want, they themselves don't often know what they want. You will give them what they ask for, and then they'll just decide based on the result set or the data or the report that you give them that, you know what, actually I don't want that, I want this other thing. So it's a process. But again, this idea of what this procedure for building complex queries look like. So really read this and spend some time thinking about it, and then implement this really in all your queries you're doing. I mean, you're new to SQL. I imagine most, if not all of you, are new to SQL at this point. So really, all queries are complex queries, right? You've never done this stuff before. So what might be simple to someone who has been doing SQL for 20 years is going to be difficult for you. So really, these steps apply to all the queries that you're doing. So I think it would be worth, again, thinking about this in context of all the queries you're working on. So what we're going to do here, I think, is look. I'm asking you as part of the homework. I'm asking you to do number 4 from the My Guitar Shop exercises. So I thought what we do is I'm going to walk you through this process that they lay out in the book on page 215, a procedure for building complex queries. And it's just a nice structured way to think about difficult problems, because often, again, if we look at number 4 in the My Guitar Shop exercises, it's pretty overwhelming to begin with, right? But if we can sort of start to pick the problem apart, chunk it into manageable queries, it's not that difficult once we start to break it down in these smaller parts. And even, the thing you can do with these subqueries, when you have subqueries, is you're able to work on the individual queries, run those, look at the results, and it just takes some of the mystery out of this process of creating these complex queries. When it's all said and done, and you're finished with the final query, if somebody's just, if somebody comes in the first time and looks at it, they're like, wow, that's impressive, but really not. As the person who actually wrote it and had to think through it, you'll get to that point where it's like, okay, it's really not that bad. It just looks, the end product looks kind of scary. But again, if you use a sort of structured process to break the problem down into smaller chunks, then it's not that bad. And that's really, I mean, to me, that's the cool thing about when thinking about this, is that's really just life, right? Anything you do in life, it looks like this big behemoth of a problem, but when you start to break it down into smaller parts, it's really not that tough. I mean, one example, there's a lot of them, but I do automotive restoration in my part time, or in my spare time. And like the process of restoration on an older vehicle, you first get it and it's full of rust, and the body's got issues, the engine's got issues. And I've done restoration on cars and motorcycles like that, and when the finished product's done, people are amazed, and they're like, wow, man, they can't believe, especially if you look at before and after pictures, they're amazed at the work. But me, as the person who's did that work, I'm thinking, it really wasn't that bad. I mean, yeah, it's a lot of time and it's hard work, but again, when you start to break it down into its individual components and the different things that you have to do, it's really not that difficult. So that being said, let's look at number 4. And I'm not going to do the whole thing, but I just want to sort of walk you through this process of breaking down a hard problem. So the first thing that the book says is state the problem to be solved by the query in plain language. So this is often difficult, just based on what we have here. Really, the second query is the one that's going to give us that sort of plain English explanation of what it's going to do. So it says, I'm just reading here on the second part of number 4. Write a second select statement that uses the first select statement in its from clause, the main query. So here's kind of the meat of what it's going to actually return. The main query should return 2 columns, customer email address, and the largest order from that customer. And then says to do this, you can also group the result by email address, and then ask you to sort the result by the largest order in descending sequence. So really, that's kind of the bulk of what we want here. The main query should return the customer's email address and the largest order for that customer. Now, so yeah, I mean, I'm just going to cut and paste that here. And I'm just going to say, let's just take the 2 columns out. Let's make this as sort of plain English as we want. And so what this is going to look like is something like, you're going to have email addresses going down 1 column, email 1. And then you're going to have what the largest order is. So this is going to be some number. And then, I mean, I'm looking, so the max order. And then like email 2, email 3. So you're going to have a column of email addresses, and then corresponding orders, or the largest order, to this is email 2, largest order. Okay, does that make sense? Again, I'm trying to give you a sense of what the final query, what the final result set is going to look like. Okay. All right. So that's step 1 here. State the problem to be solved by the query in plain language. So step number 2, and this is probably the most difficult part, I would say, is use pseudocode to outline the query. All right. So this was if I was having to put a heading on this, this is state problem in plain language. All right. So that's step number one. Step number two is going to be use pseudocode. Well, let's just copy it from here. Use pseudocode to outline this query, okay? So let's go back here and let's start to break this down. So we're going to start. So again, you've got two select statements here that we're going to write. So let's look at this first select statement. So it says write a select statement that returns 3 columns: email address, order ID, and order total for each customer. So I'm just going to say select email address, order ID, and then order total. Now, if we look at the orders table, there's no order total here. So we can get, based on the customer ID that's in this table, we can get the email address, and we can also get order ID. But notice there's no order total. So actually, order total, we're going to need to, well, and we can, let's see, is order total here? Yeah, there's no, so yeah, let me pause this for 1 second, make sure I'm on the right track. Okay, I had to make sure I understood the table structures here. To get the order total, we're going to have to incorporate not only the orders table, but also the order item table, right? So a order points to an order points to the order items table. Order items table has an item ID, and then that item ID actually has the price associated with it. So kind of regardless of that, we're still going to be, this is the initial select statement we're going to write, right? And then, so this is our first select statement, and then we've got this nested select statement. So let's go ahead and walk through that. And in fact, yeah, if we look at the description in inside the My Guitar Shop exercises, it's sort of hints to this idea of we've got to use the order items table too, right? It says to do this, you can group the results by email address, order ID, and the order ID columns. In addition, you must calculate the order total from the columns in the order items table, okay? So that's sort of beginning the initial select statement. And we can chunk these up into different, these are going to be different select statements. The idea is to sort of lay out the different bits and pieces just so we've got them down, just so we've got them down and we can see them, and then we can then later combine them into a single query. And then so it says write a second select statement that uses the first select statement in its from clause. The main query should return 2 columns in this case, and again, this is sort of our final result we talked about: the customer's email address and the largest order for that customer. To do this, you can group the results set by email address, and then it says also sort by the largest order. So in this case, we're going to do this select statement is going to look something like select, again, we're going to do email address, and then we're going to need order ID. And then we talked about the sum. So this sum statement is going to look, again, this is just rough. This is not query. This is not SQL that we could actually paste in and work, but we're just sort of trying to get the nuts and bolts of it out. The sum is going to look like item price, and then minus discount amount, and then we're going to multiply that times quantity. All right. And then this is going to be, we're going to do from customers. And then we're going to, here's where the join comes in. So we're going to join orders on customers. And then we're going to do that on customer ID, right? And then we've also got a second join here. We got to join order items on order ID. And then of course we're going to group by email address. All right. So that sort of lays out the two queries in question here. We can actually run some of these inside, we could run some of these, or at least some portion of these inside MySQL to actually look at what the result sets look like. And I mean, generally if we look at, so let's see if I describe customers. Yeah. So in this case, like the first query we've got here, select email address, order ID, and in order total. That's really going to be we're going to have to use the join statement to put that query together, right? And then if we wanted to actually run some of these queries and see what they looked like, we could do something like, and I'm going to try to actually code something up that maybe we can paste in, and is going to be it's going to be sort of the next step to actually writing the entire query here. So we could do something like select email address, and then let's do o.order underscore ID, and then let's put item price in there too. And this is going to be from customers C, and then we'll do join orders O on C dot customer ID equals O dot customer ID. And then let's also join orders or order items OI on O dot order ID. That's going to equal to OI dot order ID. Let's see if that runs. Got something not quite right here. Let's see, select email address, order ID, item price, customers, join orders, C dot customer underscore ID, O dot customer underscore ID, and then join order items on let's try that. Tabs might be messing me up here. Okay, let me pause for 1 second, see if I can get this working. Okay, I'm not sure if it was just the fact that they were upper or lowercase, but basically I think I've got the same query here. So if we paste this in, so we can see the building blocks here now. The final query is going to combine these, right? Or you're supposed to get let's go back and look here. Select statement, the main query should return email address. and the largest order for that customer. But like, these are the building blocks, right? So for instance, in the final query, when it's done for Alan Sherwood, we should only be returning order 1, right? Because, or I'm sorry, order 3, because order 3 is the largest order that he has. For Barry Z@gmail.com, he only has 1, so we're going to return that one. Same for Christine. David Goldstein, we're going to return, looks like order number 9 here, right? Because it's going to be the largest one of those. So probably the next thing you could do here is add a group by clause, and then sort of that would put you on the way there. Okay, so that gets us through. Again, we sort of created the pseudocode for this, and now we begin actually writing SQL that's going to run, and we can start to look at. So that's really step 3. Code the subqueries and test them to be sure they return the correct data. And then, of course, the final step they've got here is code and test the final query. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Again, this is just I think this procedure for building complex queries that they've got here is probably a good set of steps to follow for all the queries that you do. Again, it might not be as structured as what we just did here, but I would say for the more complex queries you work on, you should probably take the time to do it that way. I mean, the other thing is, I mean, you're not going to necessarily do it in this class because you might not have 8 or 16 hours to sit down and work on a particular query, but in a production environment in the real world, when it's your job, I mean, you'll often develop a query. It may take days or weeks to develop a particular query. Now, obviously, you're not going to sit down for 8 or 10 hours a day and just work on that query, but it's going to be a multi-step process where you're not going to sit down in one sitting and develop a particular query. It may take multiple sessions of doing just what we did here, of sort of laying out pseudocode. And then running test queries. Again, for really complex queries, you're probably going to be working either directly with a customer or maybe a product manager, something like that. So there's going to be some conversation back and forth with those folks about what it is that they're looking for. Okay, that's all for now. As always, let me know if you have questions.